All right, you guys, as you can see by the thumbnail, I'm back with another one like the other one. So check it out, you guys. I'm gonna get straight into this video. I got a banger for you guys. This one right here is hot off the press. I had intended on dropping the Baby Joker demon removal video, but this one just got dropped on me and it's still current, so I want to get this one out first. So this video right here is something that I would consider to be between a story and an update on some of the internal strife or the internal politics that are playing out right now within Florencia. But before I get into the details of this story, there's just a few things that I want to say real quick just to keep things above board and let you guys know why I decided to put out this video. So you guys all know how YouTube works. A lot of the content that you see is generated from factual stories that either happened on the streets or in some cases behind the walls in state prison. People who are either there or who got the story secondhand from someone else will then convey that story to a content creator like myself, who will then put that story in context and then present it to you guys. You know, it's not rocket science. It's pretty damn simple. And I'm sure that other genres on YouTube operate in similar fashion. However, for the so-called prison genre, there's no question about the fact that it has become to be a political weapon that has picked up a lot of momentum over the last 10 years. I mean, let's keep it real. It's become weaponized. And depending on the platform and the content creator that's conveying the story, it sometimes has the potential to garner a lot of influence. And obviously, this is something that some of the more educated and sophisticated gang members understand. Let me try to dumb this down for you guys and give you an example. You know, personally speaking, as a content creator, I've elected to put out content that revolves around gangs, gang violence, and the correlation between street gangs and some of the criminal prison organizations. And when I'm not running a story that isn't about something that I have firsthand knowledge about myself, then I'm usually running a story that's been passed on to me by somebody else who claims that it's factually based. I mean, how many times have I told you guys throughout the time that I've been putting out these stories that I'm at the mercy of other people to give me accurate information when they contact me about putting out a story? I've said it time and time again because it's true. You know, I don't know if some of you really know how many different facets that there are today, but there's a lot if you've ever taken the time out to think about it. Because now that all these channels that fall within the category of the prison genre have taken off and have evolved, I think some of these criminal organizations and some of the more sophisticated gang members that are still in the mix have finally seen and learned the true potential and power that social media has yielded. You know, it's not only become an information hub, a huge melting pot of gossip, rumors, and factually based information, but it's also become a sounding board and a political weapon that's being utilized to influence the masses. I mean, think about it, a melting pot that could also include false and negative propaganda as well. And that's the dangerous part about it. I'll get to the details of this story in a minute, but I think it's important to shed some light on this to at least elevate people's awareness. Because granted, as viewers, you guys still have the ability to pick and choose who you believe and who you consider to be wishy-washy. But it all has an effect in some form or fashion. You know, it's not a stretch to assume that there could possibly be some of the more savvy gang members out there that are watching YouTube that might try to use a content creator or their platform to spread false propaganda about one of their adversaries or about someone else that they're trying to push a political campaign about. Those are facts, the hook, line, and sinker. You know, I'm smart enough to know that this is always a real possibility. And that's why I always tell you guys to do your own research, not to run with everything that you hear on YouTube, because it's not always true. You know, let me say it again so that I'm absolutely clear on this. YouTube has become weaponized. And I'm not just talking about the prison genre either. I'm talking about across the board in all genres. You know, I'm not going to spend too much more time on this, but there's examples everywhere in every genre. Just turn YouTube on and look for yourself. And I'm not just talking about YouTube either. I'm talking about social media in general. Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, Snapchat, and Twitter, just to name a few. You know, I'll probably drop a video on the ill effects of social media sometime in the near future, but I can't emphasize to you guys enough how much it's changed the game in every aspect of the expression, literally. Anyways, ironically, one of my biggest mistakes, a mistake that others still seem to languish over, is someone who's actually part of this story, Tablas. You know, I'm sure that those of you who have been following me for at least the last couple of years remember when I dropped that video about Tablas supposedly getting hit. You know, I don't personally know Tablas. I had no agenda against Tablas, and there was nothing for me to gain from it either way. But I'm still the one that put it out there, and at the end of the day, the accountability was mine. Fortunately, it didn't destroy my credibility like others were hoping that it would, but it was something that I learned from. And those are the kind of mistakes that you don't want to make. You know, people won't care that somebody else gave you bad information or that this was all predicated on somebody else's agenda to propagate false propaganda. All they're going to see and focus on is that you're the one that put this out there and you're the one that dropped the video. You know, something like that could have been devastating for a small platform, especially when you're talking about somebody as revered as Tablas. But I'm just glad that the viewers were smart enough to figure out that this was just bad information that was conveyed to me and that I didn't have an agenda in it. We all make mistakes. All content creators make mistakes. It's gonna happen. We're human. You know, I'll be the first one to tell you guys that I'm not always right. Sometimes I get it wrong, and I'm sure there's gonna be more times in the future. But what's important is that people understand that I try to do everything that I can to get you guys accurate information. And I also think it's important that people know that I'm not known for being careless or reckless when it comes to putting my stories out. Unlike some people, I do care about my credibility. And now I'm a lot more conservative when it comes to putting that kind of trust and confidence in other people when they give me stories. If it's something that I can't cross-reference, I just won't put it out. But anyways, with that being said, let me get to the details of this story, which actually kind of goes hand in hand with everything that I just talked about. So apparently, Renegade Media put a video out a couple of days ago about Florencia. And whatever was said in that story prompted this video. Not because I'm fact checking, you guys know I don't get into all that. And to be honest with you guys, I haven't even seen the video, so I don't even know what it's about. All I know is that it has something to do with Florencia. But whatever that story was about, it obviously got a lot of attention, it got people talking, and it resulted in several people reaching out to me asking me if I could drop a video and elaborate on several things relating to Florencia and some of the internal politics that are playing out within that neighborhood right now. So there you have it, another classic example of how social media is having a direct impact on street politics. So let me just start this out by saying this. You guys have heard a lot of stories about Florencia, not just on my channel, but on several other channels as well. And next to 18th Street, you guys know that Florencia is one of the biggest street gangs in Southern California. In fact, Florencia is considered to be one of a few gangs that's referred to as a transnational gang, meaning that they have expanded or have had the ability to metastasize nationwide. Because besides South Los Angeles, they have subsets in places like Oregon, Colorado, Florida, Washington, Utah, Arizona, Mexico, and even in Canada. You know, I don't think I need to give you guys a history lesson on Florencia because there's already a lot of information out there. But just for the purpose of this story, so that I put it in the right context and premise it right, let me just say this. So for those of you that know a little bit of history about Florencia, you guys know that the Florence gang evolved in the Florence district of South Central Los Angeles back in the 1940s. And they took their name from Florence, which runs through central LA to the city of Downey and the 605 freeway. And the thing that's different about the Florence Firestone area is that it used to be a predominantly African-American neighborhood. You know, I'm not sure about the demographics or what the composition of racial or ethnic diversity looks like today. But from everything that I've heard about Florencia, it's a neighborhood that had to fight and fiercely compete with a lot of the Blood and Crip gangs just to exist in that area. So as it continued to evolve and expand in that area, by the 1960s, it had become a huge multi-generational gang stretching from central LA to the city of Huntington Park in eastern Los Angeles County. And despite some of the adversity that it's had to endure over the years, it's one of those gangs that's withstood the test of time and continues to thrive to this day. So I want to say it was in one of the last stories that I dropped on Florencia that was titled Florencia Purges One of Its Own Leaders, that I talked about Florencia's leadership, how it was structured as a gang, and how it was deeply rooted in Mexican mafia politics. The three longtime leaders of that neighborhood and the three influential members of that gang that I spoke of were Arturo Castellanos, Tablas, his older biological brother, the late Braulio Castellanos, Babo, and then of course Juan Garcia Topo, who was the main subject of that story. But another highly influential individual that I also spoke about that's also a made member of that same organization is Lionel Laredo, who's also known as Wizard. And again, just for context, Wizard also plays a major role in this story. And it's a story that clearly demonstrates how the lust for power and control, or should I say the lack of it, often leads to backstabbing, betrayal, and dirty politicking. So anyways, let's get to it. So let me take you guys back to sometime around 2004 or 2005. So at this time, there was an individual by the name of Jonathan Gonzalez, who's also known as Trigger from Florencia, from Live Oak Street, who ended up landing in Old Folsom. And while Trigger was there, apparently he picked up some kind of case. One of my sources seems to think that it was for getting caught with a banger or something along those lines. Supposedly he was on his way out to the yard, and as he's coming out of the building, he gets pulled over, searched, and that's how he got caught up. So based on the fact that this was an A1 offense, they referred the case to the outside local district attorney to see whether or not they were going to prosecute the case. And I'll be honest with you guys, at least in my experience, the DAs hardly ever picked up these kind of cases. Rarely did they pick up in-house cases that were caught in prison. Most of the time, you just ended up doing your shoot time. I know things might be different now, but 90% of the cases that were referred out to them, they used to dump them. But unfortunately for Trigger, in this scenario, the DA decided to pursue the case and they ended up filing on him. Now, based on the fact that Folsom is in Sacramento County, when you catch a case and you come up for parole, they end up sending you to the Sacramento County Jail. And that's what ended up happening to Trigger. So after sitting in Old Folsom's ad seg for about 10 or 11 months, they end up shipping Trigger off to the Sacramento County Jail, where he was then housed in the 200 pod, where they kept the Southerners and the whites. So for those of you that are familiar with the Sacramento County Jail, don't quote me on this, but I believe that the hole is on the 8th floor, which is the 100 pod. Then the 200 pod is where they keep the Southsiders and the whites. And then the 300 pod is where they kept the Northerners and the Africanos. Things might be different now, but I believe that's how it was back in 2004, 2005. So fast forward sometime around late 2005, early 2006. Trigger's been in the Sacramento County Jail for a good minute now, waiting to fight his case. And while he's there, he ends up running into Ezekiel Romo, who's also known as Wicked from Blythe Street. Some of you might remember seeing the two stories that I ran on him. One of them was called Panorama City, House Cleaning on Blythe Street. And then the second one was about his unfortunate demise that was called Wicked Intentions. If you haven't seen those stories, you might want to go back and check them out. Both of them are good stories. And Wicked was there because at around that same time, Wicked ended up catching a case in New Folsom. He ended up catching a stabbing. And they ended up shipping Wicked to the Sacramento County Jail the same way they did Trigger. So again, at one point, Wicked and Trigger, they run into each other and eventually they end up becoming cellies. So according to a couple of my sources, it was around this time that Trigger started to take more of a proactive interest in prison politics. Because prior to this, Trigger was all about being a loyal Florenciano, and he respected some of the advice that he was given by some of his older homies, guys who had already been to prison and who knew what time it was, and they encouraged him to stay away from the whole political spectrum with regards to prison. But being cellies with Wicked started grooming him up, and he started indoctrinating him on the importance of becoming politically savvy. And obviously, after being in a cell like that for a period of time, his perspective eventually started to change. So I want to say they ended up being cellies for about a year, and during that time, Wicked had Trigger assist him with all his communications. This more than likely consisted of Trigger rewriting Wicked's letters in his script and utilizing several different codes to circumvent the gang intel officers that were monitoring their mail. So at that time, Wicked had two primary channels. His two channels were Raul Leon, Weddle Sherm from Shelltown, and Mark Kuros, Turtle from Colton. However, for whatever reason, probably just Weddle Sherm being Weddle Sherm, eventually he tells Wicked to stop communicating with Turtle, which he does. And basically from that point on, Weddle Sherm became his exclusive contact. Everything that he was doing was going through Weddle Sherm. So after about a year, Wicked ends up catching a deal on the stabbing that he caught in New Folsom, and they ended up shipping him upstate to start doing his time. Meanwhile, Trigger also ends up copping to a deal. It was somewhere around 2 or 3 years, but whatever it was, he basically got credit for time served. So because he had enough time in, and because he was getting credit for time served, they put him on a bus and they shipped him off to DVI, to Tracy. Basically long enough for them to generate his parole papers and to kick him back out to the streets. So now this puts us somewhere in either early or mid 2007. And apparently Trigger, he ends up staying out for about 4 or 5 months before he caught another case out of San Bernardino County. So my source couldn't remember exactly what it was for, but he seemed to think that it was either for a strap or a G-ride. But either way, back then at that time, somewhere around 2007, San Bernardino County was sending all its new commitments, all its reception center inmates to Tehachapi. I know a lot of you guys remember when they were using Tehachapi for a reception center. They only did it for a brief period of time, but that's where they ended up sending Trigger. So when he lands in Tehachapi, he ends up selling up with Alex Castro, Sniper from Ontario Black Angels. And Sniper's a made member of the Mexican Mafia. I believe he's been a made member for at least 10 years now. But when Trigger ran into him, this was well before he was made. Right now, Sniper's in the feds, and from what I've been able to gather, he got caught up for transportation from Southern California to somewhere like Detroit. And then while he was housed at FCI Milan, waiting to get sentenced on his transportation case, he ended up catching a body on a suspected child predator. And I gotta give my props to Sniper because the victim, Christian Mayer, is suspected of being the criminal mastermind of an international child exploitation ring. Go figure. So Sniper, along with his two co-defendants in that case, Adam Wright, who also went by Creeper, and Jason Cachego, who was also called Jay, were found guilty of second-degree murder for kicking, stomping, and stabbing the victim 28 times before he was thrown down a flight of stairs. You know, again, I don't condone violence, but for somebody like that, you gotta turn a blind eye. But all this would happen years later. So because of all the time that Trigger had spent in the Sacramento County Jail with Wicked, he was already somewhat in the loop and had a pretty solid perspective on everything that was going on, politically speaking. I just left Wicked, I'm in contact with such and such, I was doing this, I was doing that, etc., etc. In other words, at that point, he was already laced up and in the know about certain things that gave him the ability to converse about all the politics. And in that lifestyle, it almost pales to the same concept as name dropping. It gives that individual a level of credibility. So taking you guys back to 2007, Trigger's now in Tehachapi, sold up with Sniper, and according to one of my sources, this is where he said that Trigger's career skyrocketed. He gets deeper into the politics. And even though Sniper wasn't a made man at that point, he had a lot of contacts and he was already in the process of being groomed up. In fact, at that time, he was in contact with the crew of Mexican Mafia members that were operating out of Hawaii. So he was linked up as well. And supposedly, like a lot of us do in prison, when we end up running into somebody that we click with, Trigger and Sniper, they had made plans to work together once they both got back out to the streets. Sniper was already in the process of working with these Mexican Mafia members that were in Hawaii, and he wanted to bring Trigger on board with them. But unfortunately, those plans would never come to fruition. In short order, this is what ended up happening. So when Trigger copped to that deal in Sacramento County and they ended up shipping him off to DVI, they shot him to the hole once he got to DVI because he still owed shoot time. And due to the fact that he paroled from the back in DVI, they ended up shooting him to the hole once he got to Tehachapi because that's just how it works. So after staying there in Tehachapi for about 8 months, he didn't even end up catching the chain to the shoe. He just ended up paroling from right there. And this is when he ended up running into Sniper and they made plans to link up on the streets. They basically both knew when they were gonna get out, they stayed in contact, and even though they did link up once they got back out there, however, the Hawaii plans, they still ended up falling through. So now fast forward sometime around 2015, which would have been about 5 or 6 years later. And life takes them both in different directions. But during that time, Trigger continues to evolve and he eventually starts to apply some of the things that he learned from guys like Wicked and Sniper to his neighborhood, Live Oak Street. He basically became the catalyst and one of the main ones that was responsible for converting Live Oak Street, his neighborhood, into Florencia. And according to one of my sources, another individual that was instrumental in that process was an individual that was only known as Youngster. And this guy Youngster was also from Live Oak Street. And he was notoriously known for putting a lot of work in on the streets. According to my source, he was wreaking havoc in places like Bell Gardens and Cudahy. The way that it was described to me is that this individual Youngster is basically the one that put Live Oak Street on the map. I know that there's going to be some people that are probably going to disagree with this, and that's okay. This isn't my fight, and I'm not that deeply invested in this. I'm just conveying the story to you guys. But anyways, Youngster supposedly ended up catching a body on the streets, and as a result, he got convicted and was sentenced to life in prison. So he ends up getting convicted, he catches a chain to Delano right after Delano opened up, and then he ends up catching another body, I believe for whacking his celly. So after he catches this second body, they shipped him off to Pelican Bay, where he ends up running into Mexican Mafia heavyweight Babo from Florencia. And again, Babo's someone who I've ran several stories on. One of the more recent ones was the one that detailed how vocal he was about saving Danny Roman Popeye from Harpies, and then the other one was about his influence within Florencia. You know, from all accounts, Babo was a highly respected individual, and he played an integral role along with his younger brother Tablas in helping to build up Florencia to what it has become today. But then unfortunately, after spending 35 years in state prison and after being granted a highly unusual compassionate release in May of 2023 due to being diagnosed with stage 4 stomach cancer, he passed away a month later in 2023. And obviously this all happened 8 years later. But anyways, going back to 2015 when Babo was still around, he ended up taking a liking to this guy Youngster, and he obviously seen a lot of potential in him. So when they were in Pelican Bay, Babo, he actually propositioned this guy Youngster about something that he already knew that he was pushing for. Babo tells him, you know what, you guys are a smaller barrio in the double S, and I would want you guys in with us, meaning to merge with Florencia and to allow Florencia to absorb them into the fold. And this is actually a common thing that happens a lot. When some of the smaller gangs align themselves with some of the bigger neighborhoods and they form a strong alliance, the smaller gangs will sometimes merge with the bigger neighborhoods and will then become subsets or cliques within that set. So after Babo approaches Youngster, Youngster reaches out to Trigger, who he'd already been in contact with. So after Babo propositions Youngster, Youngster then reaches out to Trigger, who he'd been in contact with, and he basically tells Trigger, you know what, I think it's that time. Florence was already a major influence with them, and they were already working hand in hand with them. So it made sense. Not only that, but this is something that they were already considering. You know, keep in mind that there was two things that were in play here. The main thing is that during the time frame when all this was happening, is that Babo and Tablas had aspirations to absorb all the smaller neighborhoods in South LA and to bring them all in to be a part of Florencia. They wanted to convert Southgate, Maywood, Bear Street, Cudahy 13. It was a huge power play, and some of the smaller hoods were on board with it. Hoods like Live Oak Street. So however this process is handled, and whoever's involved with that part of Florencia's recruitment process took whatever steps they needed to take, and Babo assisted Youngster and Trigger with making it happen. Babo got them in, and Live Oak Street officially became a part of F13. So while all this was going on, sometime around mid to late 2013, the feds started to take notice of F13's activities on the streets. And as a result, they started investigating several crimes that they believed Florencia was involved in. And this was a culmination of illicit activities that were allegedly taking place in South Los Angeles County, as well as several sources of correspondence that were coming out of Pelican Bay State Prison. And one of those sources ended up being Wizard from Florencia. In fact, at that time, Wizard was set up with Tablas. So here's where people are gonna spin this how they want or believe what they want based on who they support or where their loyalties lie. But again, I'm giving this to you guys the exact same way that it was passed on to me. And I have no personal stake in any of the political maneuvering that's going on. So according to several of my sources, Tablas raised his hand and became instrumental in sponsoring Wizard, not only because he believed that Wizard was ready to take that step, but also because Tablas wanted to appoint Wizard as what's been referred to as his operational leader over Florencia on the streets. You know, I'm sure there's more to it than the reasons that would have made this look like it was just self-serving, but this definitely would have given Tablas a lot more leverage over Wizard by bringing him in, and nobody can deny this. So again, it's been said that a big part of Tablas doing this is because he had plans to bring Wizard in to lead his neighborhood as a conduit through him once Wizard got back out to the streets. But this would never end up coming to fruition because again, after Tablas sponsors Wizard and starts priming him up for the streets, Wizard ends up getting himself indicted before he even has a chance to parole. And people say that he got himself indicted because Wizard is one of those types of guys that has a serious case of diarrhea of the mouth. He was either too explicit in the letters that he was writing and sending out to the streets, or he was too overt in some of the recorded conversations that were being monitored. He spoke with no discretion. You know, it's another classic case of self-inflicted deja vu. If you guys notice, all these criminal indictments, they always seem to include wiretaps and recorded phone calls where somebody's talking too much. Whether it's done on a recorded line right after you hear an admonishment telling you that this call is being monitored and recorded, or whether it's done through a contraband cell phone where somebody's just speaking too overtly. It just never seems to fail. You know, I'm not sure how many times Wizard ended up getting himself indicted, but I want to say it was at least 2 or 3 times within the span of 5 or 6 years. The first time was sometime around 2013 or 14 when he was in Pelican Bay. And then again later, sometime around 2018 or 19 when he was in Beaumont, Texas in federal prison. You know, obviously, Dablas is the only one who can say what his true motives or intentions were. He's the only one who can definitively give an accurate answer to these questions. But according to some of the people that I've talked to, they've even went as far as saying that they believe that Dablas knows that he made a mistake when he brought Wizard in. Or at the very least, he second-guessed himself for doing it. And this is all predicated on Wizard's own actions and the position that he has taken, not only against some of the people that are supporting Dablas, but against his own neighborhood, Florencia, as well. I mean, let's play devil's advocate for a minute, and let's say, for instance, that there's some truth behind Dablas's reasoning for bringing Wizard in, that a big part of it centered around Dablas's plans to appoint Wizard as his operational leader over Florencia on the streets. That whole idea or purpose fizzled out and never came to fruition because Wizard never even made it to the streets. So this was a purpose that was never even fulfilled and actually became counterproductive. So for clarity and to make you guys understand what I meant when I alluded to Wizard taking up a position against some of Dablas' supporters or against his own neighborhood, let me explain this and make sure that I'm absolutely clear on this, because this is the main point and purpose of this whole story. And although this is just one example of how personal agendas and dirty politics are sometimes pushed behind personal reasons, unfortunately, this kind of thing happens all the time. So according to several people that I talked to, they all claim that Wizard became real bitter after he got indicted and after it became clear that he was basically washed up. And again, from what I was told, one of the things that became inherently clear to a lot of Florencianos is that Wizard started taking an adverse position against anyone and everyone that supported Dablas. He basically crashed out and had an axe to grind, whether it was out of envy, jealousy, or out of anger, due to the fact that in his mind, he somehow thought that Dablas was responsible for him getting indicted. Maybe he thought it was Dablas' fault that he got caught up in all these indictments. But whatever it was, one thing that became clear to a lot of people is that he started running a personal campaign and that he was going against the grain. Not only that, but Wizard made his position even clearer when he started drawing lines in the sand by trying to influence some of the people that Babo and Dablas no longer wanted in their business. These were all people that they had cut loose and weren't seeing eye to eye with for one reason or another. But here's the kicker. When Wizard got indicted and it became clear that he was destined to federal prison, this basically 86'd all the plans that he had with Dablas, and he became part of the federal faction. All those plans fell wayside, and like it or not, it changed the dynamics across the board. So I would assume that because Dablas ended up falling back and Wizard picked up on the lack of communication and the distance between them, Wizard ended up interpreting this as if he was no longer being kept in the loop and that he was no longer part of Florencia's leadership. And I could see how Wizard might have felt like he was being cut off, but unfortunately, that's just the way things work. This is business. And I could see how Wizard might have felt like he was being cut off, but unfortunately, that's just the way things work. And when your jurisdiction has a stamp on it, it's just business. But anyways, apparently Wizard's antics didn't just stop there. Since he's been housed at the Metropolitan Detention Center for the past several years, I'm not sure exactly how long, but it's at least been somewhere close to 5 years. He's imposed his own personal will on several other sureños that have come through there. So the way that this was explained to me is that Wizard was making these guys feel like something fishy was going on if the district attorney was offering these guys deals, or that there was something suspect about somebody that was being given an opportunity to bail out. He was basically planting seeds in other people's minds, saying that it's highly suspicious that this guy all of a sudden is getting a deal, or that this guy is being allowed to bail out on a case like that without any kind of factual basis. As far as he was concerned, everybody was a snitch, everybody turned on him, and everybody was suspect. So there was a lot of guys there that didn't want to take some of the deals they were being offered or debated on whether or not they should bail out based on the seeds that Wizard was planting. They didn't want that dark cloud of suspicion over him. And this is highly uncharacteristic because a righteous Mexican mafia member would try to lead and guide their people. They try to help them do what's best for them. And they wouldn't try to lead you up shit creek without a paddle. You know, I personally don't have the answers of why anybody would want to do this other than a classic case of misery loving company. At any rate, Wizard's been there at MDC prolonging his case for a long time now, for several years. And some people actually believe that the federal faction might even be waiting for him to get sentenced and hit one of the federal FCIs. They also believe that Wizard himself knows this because aside from all the things that he's been doing at MDC, people say that he's been running his mouth way too much, saying that downtown belongs to him. And nobody ever gave him that. You know, who knows whether it's true or not? It's not my place to say it one way or the other, but people close to him that are well aware of everything that's been going on sure seem to think that there's some truth to this. And you guys got to remember, you got some heavyweights that belong to the federal faction. They're probably saying, what the fuck? We're all from Los. What makes you think this is your backyard or that this all belongs to you? You know, one thing that history should have taught Wizard is that the Mexican mafia as a whole doesn't like those individuals who start grandstanding and eventually who start thinking that they become bigger than the program. And I'll be honest with you guys, when I heard all this, one of the first questions that came to my mind and that I eventually asked was, if Wizard was doing all this, how come Tablas didn't take steps to clip his wings if he was working against him? And the answer that I got made a lot of sense. Tablas isn't the type of guy who would allow himself to get caught up in politicking against another brother, which just so happens to be one of the Mexican mafia's cardinal rules, not to politic against each other. And more importantly, Tablas realizes that this is bigger than his neighborhood and that those internal politics don't rise above the laws of the Mexican mafia. And two, it now became a lot more complicated because Wizard now fell under the jurisdiction of the federal faction. So Tablas apparently just pushed back and continued to do his thing, knowing that these types of things never go unchecked, confident that sooner or later it's gonna get dealt with. So meanwhile, while all this is going on, Trigger, he continues to excel within his neighborhood. And as his potential develops, he takes on more responsibility on the streets. By now, he's in the thick of the politics, and he ends up becoming real tight with an individual by the name of Celerino Jaramillo, who's also known as Bizzy from Florencia. Now, Bizzy was already in a leadership role in the streets, and despite him being so young, somewhere in his mid to late 20s, a lot of his homies from his neighborhood admired him because of how sharp he was. For being in his mid to late 20s, his business acumen, his level of intelligence, and his ability to lead the way that he did was well beyond the potential of what he should have been. But whether you believe in that lifestyle or not, the one thing that Bizzy's homeboys continued to emphasize is that Bizzy knew exactly what he wanted to be in life, and he was determined to do whatever it entailed to get there. His entire purpose and focus in life was to someday become a made man. That was his focus in life, to someday become a member of the Mexican mafia. And this is what he was striving for. So Bizzy also had high expectations for Trigger as well. And at one point he started grooming Trigger up for what he knew was eventually gonna come, the inevitable. Either him slipping up and making a mistake or someone telling on him. But however it was gonna happen, he knew that someday he was eventually gonna get caught up. And I've said this before, but nobody ever makes it for that long anymore. Not when you're functioning on that level. Somebody's eventually gonna tell on you, or you're gonna make a mistake. You know, my sources said that this is something that he talked openly about. He had premonitions all the time about getting busted, and he knew that someday he was eventually gonna get indicted. He knew he was on borrowed time, so in preparation for that, he started grooming Trigger up so that he could take over when that time came. And apparently Bizzy wanted that transition to be a smooth one. So Bizzy and Trigger were always together. Wherever Bizzy went, he took Trigger with him. And according to my sources, these two were fiercely loyal to each other. They had each other's backs. And then it finally happened. In August of 2024, Bizzy finally got busted. All the premonitions and fears that Bizzy was having about getting caught up and indicted played out on August 6th of 2024. So this came after the feds unsealed a federal RICO indictment against 37 members and associates of Florencia. So they were hit with an 11-count indictment that included 3 bodies and a series of other crimes that included interstate trafficking, weapons, and extortion. Some of the main players in that indictment besides Bizzy was an individual named Jonathan Reyes, who they called Creeper, Oscar Hernandez, who went by Drex, and Hugo Pineda, who was also known as Menace. And allegedly, according to the indictment, these guys, they had their hands in everything. Trafficking fentanyl, 3 bodies, extortion, collecting extortionate street taxes, weapons violations, and they were also allegedly involved in running casitas, a venture that's become a huge source for generating a lot of money these days. Casitas are basically legitimate bars, clubs, or even houses that stay open after hours to select people who are only known within that criminal underworld. They'll either set up gambling rackets and let people come in and gamble at the tables, or in some of the more advanced casitas, they'll bring in slot machines so that people can come in and gamble that way. There's a lot of money involved, and like I said, it's a huge source of income, especially once they establish a steady flow of clientele. So anyways, once Bizzy got caught up, Trigger stepped up and took over his plan. And according to my sources, there was no doubt in anybody's mind that it was going to be Trigger. But here's where things start to go sideways. As Trigger continues to shine and takes on more of a leadership role within his neighborhood, this puts him in Wizard's crosshairs and he becomes to be a resented target. And again, according to my sources, if Trigger was guilty of anything, it was for being fiercely loyal to Tablas. Everyone knew that he would ride or die for this guy, and it was actually his loyalty for Tablas that made that target on his back get bigger and bigger. Because here's the thing, you gotta remember that all the Florence Firestone district, that all belonged to Tablas. And whenever a business opportunity or business venture would come up that concerned Wizard, Trigger didn't involve himself in it, he wouldn't assist him, and he wouldn't be a part of it. He didn't want to, he was told not to, and at the same time, Trigger made a point out of never interfering or hindering with Wizard's progress. He allowed him to make his money, and he never interfered with the people that were working under him. That's just the way it was. But because Trigger was avoiding him, and because he was steering clear of all his activities, Wizard interpreted this as a form of disrespect. Damn if you do, damn if you don't. He took it like, oh, you don't fuck with me, so you don't respect me. You know who the fuck I am? And that wasn't Trigger's position. He respected Wizard's status as a made man and as one of his big homies. But at the same time, all Trigger was doing was respecting the directives that he was being given by Tablas. He was honoring those directives and he was trying his best not to clash with Wizard, but it happened anyway. But in the course of all the efforts he was making to avoid from clashing with this guy, it actually ended up making this situation worse. You know, it's a cold position to be in, but unfortunately, this is a perfect example of how dirty politics can get. Or like Ice Cube would say, this is what happens when you swim with big fish in a small pond. You know, what it all comes down to is this, and Wizard will never admit this to Tablas, but Wizard's taking the position that he's taking against some of the people that are supporting Tablas because he's bitter. And because Wizard can't eat off of the same plate as Tablas. That's what it all comes down to. And it's exacerbated by the fact that Wizard is not allowed to have nothing to do with his neighborhood. And that he's not involved with his neighborhood the way that he feels he should be. It's a case of entitlement. You know, I'll just say this. Obviously, nobody knows what Wizard's gonna do in the future. But it's a well-proven fact that when somebody knows that they got something coming, that they start to crash out and they start kicking up a lot of dust. I'm not saying that that's what Wizard is doing, but some people think that's exactly what he's doing. And again, don't go after the messenger, but a lot of the people that I talk to, they feel like Wizard is solely responsible for causing a lot of the discord and dissension right now within Florencia. You know, when some of Wizard's antics were being described, it was said with an air of humor attached to it, but he was described as the type of guy who was known for asking people if he could borrow $20 with no intentions of ever paying it back. Hey, my boy, can I hold 20? Can I borrow 20? And then if you ask for it back, he get mad and he call you petty. I was asked specifically to give an example in that same context because a lot of people would say that that was spot on. You know, the other thing that was explained, which may or may not be relevant to some people, is that Wizard isn't even from a clique within Florencia and never has been. I guess amongst Florencianos, being from one of the sub-cliques gives you some level of credibility. It means that you've been putting work in for Florencia, and it also means that you're part of the inner fold. On the contrary, if you're not from a clique, then you would identify yourself as being from the neighborhoods, and you just don't have the same level of credibility. Like I said, that might carry some weight with some people, and other people might not care one way or the other. I'm just giving you guys everything that was given to me. So getting back to Trigger and the animosity that Wizard obviously had for this guy, things would only continue to get worse after Trigger got indicted in December of 2024 and ended up landing in MDC on the same floor with Wizard. So here's the thing, apparently Trigger comes from a family that you wouldn't necessarily consider to be wealthy, but they own a few houses, and his mother and father worked all their lives. And in the course of working all their lives, they were able to put a life savings aside and live somewhat comfortable. But as soon as he got out, Wizard started floating these rumors again about how it was highly suspicious that this guy bailed out on a case like this, that there was something fishy going on, that people needed to be careful around him, etc., etc. There's nothing suspicious about somebody that bails out on an indictment. Most of my co-defendants that got indicted with me bailed out. Some of them actually ended up getting OR. Just because you get indicted doesn't mean you can't bail out. Granted, sometimes when you get indicted, you get hit with some heavy charges and your bail ends up being a ransom. But sometimes people have the means to bail out, and it's as simple as that. So this was just more unfounded speculation with no factual basis. Why is it suspicious for somebody to bail out when they have the means or the resources to do it? But again, this wasn't personal. Trigger never disrespected Wizard, had never been in a conflict with them, and never questioned his authority as a made man. But unfortunately for Trigger, as long as he continued to maintain a leadership role within Florencia, and as long as he continued to demonstrate his loyalty towards Tablas, Wizard was going to stay on him, and he was going to continue to throw his shade. Whether it was behind Wizard being bitter, or whether it was behind him being envious of Trigger's position, there wasn't nothing that Trigger could do to stop it. And let me be clear about this. Trigger isn't the Lone Ranger. He's just one of many targets that Wizard has gone after. And the common denominator that makes it more than obvious is that everybody that Wizard was going after were all strong supporters of Tablas. So by Wizard's own accord and by his own actions, he clearly has an agenda against Tablas and the people who are supporting him. You know, the last part of this that's making this whole situation a lot worse is that Wizard continues to talk about all this in MDC openly on a recorded line. This is coming straight from some of the individuals that are there in MDC with them, and they've compared it to being along the same lines as dry snitching, and people are upset about it. And this is the reason why Wizard continues to keep getting indicted. Apparently, he's being reckless on the phones, and this is how a lot of the information is being openly disseminated. You know, somebody else who was notorious for doing this was Emiliano Lopez, Tonito from Wimas. He had a bad habit of talking openly on the phone, and this was despite knowing that the gang intel officers were listening and monitoring all his calls. And unfortunately, it sounds like Wizard's doing the same thing. Anyways, to wrap this up, I have a few quick closing thoughts for you guys. You know, first of all, it's unfortunate that Florencia has been afflicted with this type of internal corruption, and that one individual has been allowed to create this much discord and division within that neighborhood, especially when there's so many young Florencianos who are taking notice. But unfortunately, this is par for the course across the board, and these types of things are happening everywhere, in every neighborhood. You know, there's so many different facets that play a role in why the game has drastically changed over the years that it's mind-blowing. Nobody knows who to trust anymore. People are playing both sides. People are backstabbing each other. Loyalty is hard to come by these days, and it just seems like everybody has some type of self-serving agenda. But that's just one side of it. The main thing that I wanted to point out in this story is just how dirty and how convoluted the political game has become. It's gotten so bad that it's discouraged a lot of people, and they've simply walked away from it. There's no more trust, no more carnalismo, and leadership has become so heavy-handed that it's killed the voices of its own people. Nobody speaks up and brings their vision to the table anymore because they fear they'll become a target. You know, I can go on and on with this and give you guys example after example, but nonetheless, this is where we're at. But this story right here is just one example of how the lust for power and greed has corrupted an entire underworld. An underworld that used to be built on a belief system that had some of the most purest core values and principles in the game, when there was such thing as a cause. It didn't matter where you were from or where your loyalties lied. We all had a cause, whether you were norteño, sureño, black, white, it didn't matter. And it was all about bettering your people and doing your part to make sure that they prospered. But this all changed when it all became about supposedly becoming self-solvent, self-sustaining, making money, taxation, and freelancing. That's when the spoils of corruption destroyed everything. And this ain't poison, this is the truth. These were just the smoke screens that justified the means. Everything became corrupted, and then it was just about personal gain, self-interest, and people at the top lining their own pockets. The other thing that some of you guys should be taking away from this story is just how much of an impact social media really has on the streets, gang politics, and on some of these criminal prison organizations with all gangs. You know, like I said, these guys are some very smart, savvy individuals. And there's a good reason why they have designated people watching and sending them these types of videos when they drop. Think about it. You know, I wouldn't go as far as saying that they believe everything that they hear on social media or that they'd even be willing to put their stamp on it, but everything has an effect, whether it's big or small. Whether it becomes the basis for an investigation, using social media as a sounding board, as a vehicle to spread false or negative propaganda, or for just gathering intel, there's always some type of underlying purpose that's utilized for their benefit. I don't have no ill feelings towards them, and personally, it's not my business whether something happens to him or not. It's not my business. I'm just relaying the story. You know, one thing's for sure though, he has a lot of people speculating, waiting to see whether or not he's gonna be embraced with open arms, or if something sinister lies ahead for him. And I guess only time will tell. It's just unfortunate that there's still a lot of guys in the mix who end up being some of the most steadfast believers, but at some point they end up falling victim to dirty politics that are always being propagated by someone with status who has a personal agenda and an axe to grind. The more I see, the more it becomes clear that it's just not fun being a gang member anymore. There's just too many things working against you. And I hope some of you youngsters are paying attention. In the meantime, Tablas remains at the helm of Florencia and business continues to go on as usual. You know, the one thing that Tablas has proven time and time again is that he can't be shaken out of character and that he continues to move in the shadows, maintaining a level of mystique that keeps people guessing. Anyways, I hope you guys have enjoyed this episode of Paradigm Profiles. If you guys liked this episode, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't like this episode, give it a thumbs down. But either way, drop a comment and let me know what you think. As always, I just want to thank those of you who continue to show your unwavering loyalty and for also continuing to tap into the channel. With that being said, you guys enjoy the rest of your day and keep pushing that positivity. Until the next one, this is your boy B, and I'm gone.